It began with silence. For years, the Whitaker house on Brookfield Lane had been alive with the sounds of life, laughter spilling from the kitchen, a dog barking at the mailman, the hum of sprinklers in the yard. Then, one crisp October morning, everything stopped. Curtains stayed drawn. The cars never moved. And the once friendly home at the end of the cul-de-sac turned into a tomb of unanswered questions. Neighbors first noticed the change when the Whitakers missed Sunday service. That alone wasn't unusual, families skipped sometimes. But by the second week, the mail was piling up, and the family's two golden retrievers, Max and Clover, were no longer visible in the backyard. The air around the house seemed heavier, as if it was holding its breath. The Whitakers had lived in the small Virginia suburb for over a decade. Robert Whitaker, 48, was once a successful contractor, charismatic, ambitious, the kind of man who shook every hand twice. His wife, Elaine, 45, had run a local art studio where neighborhood kids took painting lessons on weekends. Their children, 17-year-old Matthew and 12-year-old Lily, were polite, bright, and adored by teachers. They were the kind of family people quietly envied, close, stable, content. But things had changed in the months before the silence. Robert's construction business had begun to crumble after a series of failed projects and unpaid loans. Behind closed doors, bills stacked high on the counter, credit cards maxed out. Elaine confided in a friend that Robert hadn't been sleeping, that he'd become distant and cold. "He says God's testing him," she whispered once, her voice trembling. It was around that time that Robert began attending private meetings held by a fringe religious group calling themselves the Sons of Revelation. They met in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. What started as Bible study soon turned into something else, talk of purification, sacrifice, and divine missions. Neighbors said Robert looked thinner, hollowed out. He stopped smiling. In early September, Robert purchased a firearm from a local dealer. He told the clerk it was for home defense. Weeks later, he was seen at a secluded shooting range outside the county, using a silencer. He practiced alone, methodical and calm. Elaine, trying to keep their lives from unraveling, suggested a family weekend, a small getaway to a nearby lake. Photos from that trip would later surface, the family smiling at sunset, a barbecue on the porch, Lily holding a sparkler. They looked happy, almost eerily so, as if the moment had been staged. That was the last anyone saw them alive. By the following Friday, calls to the Whitaker home went unanswered. Robert's co-workers received a typed letter stating he had accepted a classified contract with the Department of Energy and would be traveling with his family for several months. Friends received similar notes, postmarked from different cities. Elaine's mother received a short, unsigned card, "We're safe. Don't worry. Love always." But the handwriting wasn't hers. 3 weeks later, a concerned neighbor finally called the police. Officers forced entry through the back door. Inside, everything was immaculate, dinner plates washed, beds made, no sign of struggle. The family photos still lined the mantel, though something about them felt off. In one frame, Robert's face had been carefully cut out. In the backyard, beneath the stone terrace Robert had built that summer, the earth looked freshly disturbed. And under that cold Virginia soil, investigators were about to uncover the truth that would turn the quiet neighborhood into a place of horror. The morning the excavation began, Brookfield Lane was wrapped in fog. Yellow police tape fluttered against the fence, and the once inviting Whitaker home stood under a gray sky, its silence broken only by the low hum of generators and the rhythmic scrape of shovels against earth. Officers moved carefully, speaking in hushed tones, aware that whatever lay beneath the terrace could change everything. At 9:47 a.m., the first discovery was made, a section of blue tarp. Beneath it, a layer of heavy soil had been compacted with deliberate precision. Detective Laura Hensley, who led the scene, exchanged a look with her partner, Detective Ron Mercer. They both knew this was no random burial. The arrangement was methodical, the spacing exact. As the soil gave way, a strong, metallic odor filled the air. Minutes later, gloved hands exposed a small, delicate wrist. Then another. By noon, 4 bodies had been uncovered, a woman and 2 children wrapped in bedding, and a dog positioned beside them as though it had been placed there gently. Each had been shot at close range. Each had traces of a sedative in their system later confirmed by toxicology. The 4th grave, slightly apart from the rest, held another dog, Max, curled as if sleeping. Near the head of the burial site, detectives found an arrangement of strange objects, a wooden cross, a rusted key, and a small mirror engraved with faint initials, R.W. A nearby tree bore a freshly carved symbol resembling an eye surrounded by flames. Detective Mercer murmured, "This wasn't just murder. This was ritual." Word spread quickly. By afternoon, the street was lined with reporters, their cameras reflecting the blue and red lights that washed over the scene. Neighbors watched from porches, clutching mugs of coffee they didn't drink. Some wept, others stood motionless, stunned by the thought that the cheerful man who once hosted barbecues could commit something so horrifying. Inside the house, investigators worked room by room. In the master bedroom, they found an unregistered handgun case and an empty box of sleeping pills. In the study, Robert's private office, they discovered notebooks filled with erratic handwriting, verses, symbols, and long passages about redemption through earthly silence. One page was titled "The Cleansing of the Circle." Pinned to the wall beside his desk was a map with red lines connecting several small towns across the state, and in the center, a note, "Final Path, October 12." Forensic teams estimated the killings had occurred nearly 3 weeks earlier, the same weekend as the family trip to the lake. Robert, they concluded, had likely administered sedatives that evening. The doses were enough to render his family unconscious, but not instantly fatal. Then, sometime after midnight, he used the firearm, fitted with the suppressor, to end their lives quietly. He then spent hours burying them beneath the terrace he had built himself, mixing the soil with quick-drying cement to disguise the disturbance. The next morning, he began sending letters and making calls that would keep up the illusion that the Whitakers were alive and traveling. Detective Hensley stared at the burial site long after the bodies were removed. "It's almost like he wanted to keep them close," she said quietly. Mercer nodded grimly. "Or make sure no one else could have them." By the second week of the investigation, more unsettling details emerged. Financial records revealed Robert had drained his family's savings and sold multiple assets in the weeks leading up to the killings. Surveillance footage from a nearby ATM showed him withdrawing cash just hours after the presumed murders. He appeared calm, even smiling slightly at the camera. Another chilling discovery came from the family's answering machine, a message left on October 10, 2 days after their deaths. It was Robert's voice, casual and composed. "Hey, it's Rob. We're heading out for a while, might be hard to reach us. Tell everyone not to worry. The world's got bigger plans for us." The tone was almost cheerful. But there was no background noise, no voices, no movement, no life. When Robert's vehicle was later found abandoned near a motel 200 miles away, it only deepened the mystery. Inside were clothes, toiletries, and a wallet containing his ID and several credit cards. But there was no sign of Robert Whitaker himself. The receipts, however, told a story, a trail of hotels, small towns, and late-night gas station stops stretching all the way to the Tennessee border. He wasn't hiding his name. He wanted to be seen. That night, as detectives packed up for the day, a light rain began to fall over Brookfield Lane. The fresh soil darkened, and the sound of drops tapping against the yellow tape echoed through the empty yard. Somewhere out there, the man who had buried his family with his own hands was still moving, methodical, deliberate, and unrepentant. And the hunt for him had only just begun. By the time Robert Whitaker's vehicle was discovered, the investigation had already consumed the town. National media had picked up the story, dubbing him the family vanisher. His face, once a familiar presence at community events, now stared back from every television screen, his eyes hollow and unreadable. Detective Laura Hensley stood over the car that morning, parked crookedly near a cheap roadside motel in Bristol, Tennessee. The windshield was smeared with dust, and a parking ticket fluttered under the wiper. Inside, the car looked almost staged: wallet, toiletries, a Bible, and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in foil. But the most chilling detail was the note tucked into the sun visor, written in the same handwriting as the letters he had mailed. It read simply, "They're sleeping in peace now. Don't follow me. God will." Hensley folded the note carefully. "He wants us to chase him," she said. "He's not hiding, he's performing." Robert's trail stretched across several states, and every new clue felt deliberate. Surveillance cameras captured him at gas stations, hotel lobbies, and convenience stores. He used his real name, his own credit cards, never disguising himself. At each stop, he stayed only one night, always alone. Witnesses described him as calm, polite, and strangely unbothered. A few even said he seemed peaceful. At a diner outside Knoxville, a waitress named Karen Bowers remembered him clearly. "He came in around 6, she told investigators. Ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie. He asked if we believed in redemption. I thought he was just another preacher passing through." She paused. "He tipped $50 on a $10 bill." Detectives followed the receipts like breadcrumbs: Knoxville, Chattanooga, Birmingham, each stop bringing them closer to understanding his state of mind, but not to finding him. Alongside the physical trail, investigators began to untangle Robert's financial and personal networks. His business records showed years of quiet deceit, forged signatures, falsified permits, phantom employees. The debts he'd hidden had spiraled into hundreds of thousands of dollars. More disturbing were the payments traced to members of the Sons of Revelation, the same religious sect Robert had joined in the months before the murders. The group was small and secretive, known for its apocalyptic teachings. Former members described their meetings as sermons about purification and the cleansing of the unworthy. One ex-member told police that Robert had been particularly fixated on the concept of sacrifice, offering what's most precious to prove faith. Detective Mercer studied the sect's website, an amateur page filled with cryptic verses and grainy photos. In one post dated a week before the murders, a user with the initials R.W. had written, "When the circle is broken, salvation begins." It was the same phrase found in his journals. Meanwhile, tips poured in from across the country. Some claimed to have seen him hitchhiking. Others swore he was living off-grid with the sect. Dozens of false leads drained the team's resources, each one ending the same way: a dead end and more questions. Then came the call that changed everything. A hotel clerk in Mobile, Alabama, reported a man matching Robert's description who had checked in under his own name: calm, cooperative, paying with a credit card. He stayed one night, left early the next morning, and asked for directions to Dauphin Island. The clerk remembered one eerie detail: before leaving, Robert had asked where the nearest church was, but added quietly, "I don't need to go inside. I've already made peace." By the time investigators reached the island, Robert was gone. His footprints led down to the shoreline, ending where the sand met the water. No one saw him board a boat. No one saw him return. For weeks, divers searched the bay. Nothing surfaced. But then, a new layer of deception began to unfold. While combing through phone records, detectives discovered that multiple calls had been made from Robert's cell phone in the days after his disappearance, not from Alabama, but from different states across the Southeast. Each call was placed to the same number, registered to a woman named Grace Porter, a known affiliate of the Sons of Revelation. Grace, when questioned, claimed she hadn't heard from Robert in months, but her unease was palpable. Her small farmhouse outside Atlanta contained handwritten letters addressed to Brother R. Each one was filled with scripture and instructions written in Robert's handwriting: "Continue the work. The flesh must rest, but the spirit will travel. It was becoming clear, someone was helping him. Someone who still believed he was alive. Detective Hensley stared at the evidence board one late evening, the lines of string connecting photos, bank slips, and grainy stills of Robert's face. "He's not running," she said softly. "He's preaching through the trail. Every place he touches, every note he leaves, it's part of his sermon." Mercer leaned back in his chair. "So where does the sermon end?" She didn't answer. Because deep down, she feared the truth, it might not end until he wanted it to. By winter, the case had shifted from a manhunt into something far stranger, a descent into the inner workings of a shadowed belief system. Detective Laura Hensley's desk was buried under files about the Sons of Revelation, a group that operated quietly across several southern states. The more she read, the clearer it became, this wasn't a church. It was a machine of manipulation. The group had begun decades earlier as a splinter ministry, led by a man named Silas Crane, a former pastor who claimed to have received visions during a near-death experience. His sermons promised a form of personal salvation through purging worldly corruption. Over time, Crane's words twisted into doctrine. Members were told that true faith required proof, acts of surrender, separation from family, and devotion to divine truth. Robert Whittaker had fallen into that orbit during his lowest point. Witnesses described how, in his final months, he became obsessed with Crane's teachings. He spent hours transcribing scripture by hand, attending closed meetings where outsiders were unwelcome. One former member remembered Robert arriving one night with a notebook full of blueprints, diagrams of his home, the terrace, even the backyard. He said he was preparing for the quietening, the man recalled. Said the Lord had chosen his household for rest. Hensley shuddered when she read that testimony. The quietening. That word had appeared several times in Robert's writings, always in the same chilling context, the quietening of the circle. The end of earthly noise. The search for Crane led detectives to a rural compound in northern Georgia. The property sat hidden among thick pines, protected by high fences and warning signs that read private worship, keep out. When local authorities arrived with a warrant, they were met by a handful of nervous followers dressed in plain clothing, their faces calm, almost eerily blank. Inside the main building, a converted barn, the walls were lined with religious imagery, crosses, eyes painted within flames, and phrases written in chalk like, "The hour of silence is mercy." There was no sign of Silas Crane. His quarters were empty, bed neatly made, as if he'd simply vanished. In a locked drawer, officers found a folder labeled, R.W. Inside were photographs of Robert Whittaker at various gatherings, smiling, shaking hands, even leading small prayer circles. One note, written by Crane himself, described him as, a man chosen for demonstration. Detective Hensley's pulse quickened as she read those words aloud. Demonstration of what? Mercer asked. She exhaled slowly. Sacrifice. Among the items seized was a handheld camcorder containing several recordings. The footage was grainy, timestamped just weeks before the murders. It showed Robert standing at a podium in the barn, addressing a dozen followers. His voice was steady, confident, almost serene. "The world blinds us with comfort," he said. "We build homes that trap us, fill them with false love and greed. But when the time comes, we must unbuild what we have built, return to purity." Applause followed. Then silence. The tape cut abruptly. Investigators now faced two chilling possibilities: either Crane had orchestrated the murders as part of a larger ritual, or Robert had acted alone, consumed by the ideology. The truth seemed to lie somewhere in between. In Crane's correspondence, officers found coded letters referencing the Second Circle and those continuing the work. Bank transfers linked several members to cash withdrawals made under false identities, some dated days after Robert's disappearance. One transfer, in particular, matched a withdrawal made in Mobile, Alabama, the the same day Robert had been sighted. Grace Porter, the woman who had received Robert's calls, reappeared in the investigation. When confronted with the evidence, she finally broke. She admitted to meeting Robert after the murders. He had arrived at her farmhouse late at night, carrying a duffel bag and a Bible. His hands trembled, but his expression was calm. He said they were asleep now, Grace whispered. He said he'd done what was asked of him. Then he prayed for hours, just whispered and cried. In the morning, he was gone. Did he say where he was going? Hensley asked. Grace hesitated. He said he was going to find the next circle, the place where the water ends. That phrase would send investigators combing through coastal towns, rivers, and ferry routes. Yet every lead grew cold. It was as though Robert had stepped off the map entirely, vanishing into the landscape of his own delusion. Meanwhile, public fascination with the case exploded. Documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dissected every detail, from the sect's rituals to theories that Robert had faked his death. Some believed Crane had helped him disappear. Others insisted Robert was still alive, living under a new identity among fringe believers. For Detective Hensley, it was no longer about publicity or headlines. It was about understanding how a man could fall so far, how a devoted father could become an architect of horror. She spent nights replaying the footage, the sound of Robert's voice echoing in her mind. There was no rage, no madness, only conviction. He didn't see it as murder, she murmured to Mercer one evening. He saw it as release. Mercer looked away. Then he's not coming back. But weeks later, a call came from a small town in coastal Louisiana. A motel clerk there had recognized a photo of Robert on television. A man matching his description had stayed under the name Daniel Wright for 2 nights, quiet, polite, carrying a worn leather Bible. He paid in cash, left before dawn, and told the clerk he was heading south, to finish his task. In the trash outside the motel, police found a torn page from that Bible. On it was a single line, underlined twice, "The sea will cleanse what the earth could not." Detective Hensley's voice was barely above a whisper when she read it. He's still walking his sermon. The lead from Louisiana jolted the investigation back to life. Detective Laura Hensley and her partner, Ron Mercer, boarded a pre-dawn flight to New Orleans, landing under low clouds and heavy air that smelled of salt and rain. The closer they got to the Gulf, the more the case felt like chasing a ghost that wanted to be found just enough to keep the story alive. The small town of Belle Chain sat an hour south of the city, wedged between marshland and endless water. The motel where Robert Whittaker had stayed was a crumbling roadside stop called the Driftwood Inn. Its sign flickered weakly, one neon letter short of working. Inside, the manager, a soft-spoken man named Harris, remembered Robert clearly. "Quiet guy," he said. "Paid cash. Said he was writing a book about redemption." He paused, frowning. He spent hours sitting out by the docks, staring at the water. Didn't even blink when the rain started. Hensley stepped out to that same dock. The boards creaked beneath her boots, and the gray horizon bled into the sea. She imagined Robert sitting there, a man who had murdered his family, watching the waves like they held some divine answer. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of flight. Just stillness. Then she noticed something. A pile of burned paper near the edge of the dock, scraps of notebook pages, half-obliterated words visible through the soot, silence, circle, the tide takes the flesh. Mercer crouched beside her. Looks like he tried to erase himself. Or make sure we could only read what he wanted, she replied. The next clue came 2 days later. A credit card charge appeared in Biloxi, Mississippi, a small purchase for fuel. The card was in Robert's name, but the timestamp was odd. It had been used 4 hours after security footage confirmed the card was still in Louisiana. Investigators realized someone else might be using his information, a deliberate misdirection. Hensley's team widened the search radius, combing through ATM cameras, toll booths, and border checkpoints. They found fragments, a man fitting Robert's description on grainy footage at a rest stop outside Gulfport, walking toward a wooded area at night. Another sighting surfaced from a fisherman who claimed he'd given a lift to a strange, polite man along the coast. He talked about how the world was ending, the fisherman told police. Said he had to meet someone before the water rose. The phrase, "the water rose," appeared again days later when a postmark arrived at the mobile police station. Inside a plain envelope was a single photograph, the view of a marsh at sunset, no faces, no footprints. On the back, written in blue ink, "The water will take me where justice can't." The handwriting matched Robert's exactly. By now, his name was everywhere. News channels ran nightly updates, tabloids speculated wildly. Some claimed he had joined a commune of believers along the coast, others thought he had drowned himself in a symbolic act of purification. But detectives couldn't dismiss one possibility, that he had help. The sect's fingerprints were everywhere. Financial records showed money moving through shell accounts connected to small religious nonprofits. Several were traced to Grace Porter and a man named Elias Crane, the estranged son of the sect's founder, Silas. Elias, now living in Florida under a different name, became their next lead. When officers brought him in for questioning, Elias appeared calm, almost detached. He admitted the group had been preparing sanctuaries for its followers, quiet places away from the world's corruption. Robert was one of Father's believers, Elias said. He thought silence could erase sin. Father called him the living example. Hensley pressed harder. Did your father tell him to kill his family? Elias smiled faintly. My father didn't need to tell anyone what to do. He only showed them the path. The rest, they chose. That night, Elias was released due to lack of evidence, but Hensley couldn't shake the feeling he knew more. He's protecting someone, she told Mercer. Maybe his father. Maybe Robert himself. The following week brought a storm. The Gulf churned under black skies, wind howling through the cypress trees. As the rain came down, a Coast Guard patrol found an abandoned skiff washed ashore near Grand Bay. Inside were a few personal items, a lantern, a blanket, and a waterproof satchel. Inside the satchel was a Bible, its pages warped from water, and a small pocketknife engraved with the initials R.W. But there was no body. The discovery reignited speculation. Some believed Robert had taken his own life in the storm. Others whispered that he had faked his death with help from the sect, slipping away into the swamps. Forensic analysis on the boat yielded no fingerprints except his own. No blood, no sign of struggle. The Coast Guard scoured the bay for days, but nothing surfaced. Not a trace. When the storm finally cleared, Hensley returned to the dock in Belle Chain. The air smelled of seaweed and engine oil. She stared at the endless horizon, knowing that somewhere beneath that gray expanse might lie the answer, or another deception. Mercer joined her, hands in his pockets. If he's dead, he chose how it ended. If he's alive, he's still preaching, she finished. He nodded grimly. And someone's still listening. 2 days later, an anonymous letter arrived at the FBI field office in Richmond. It was short, typed, and signed, but the message was unmistakable: you buried the wrong man. The envelope contained a photograph taken in a small Florida town weeks earlier. In the background of a grocery parking lot, blurred but recognizable, was a man who looked exactly like Robert Whitaker, older, thinner, wearing a baseball cap, holding a coffee cup. The timestamp was from 9 days after the storm that supposedly claimed his life. Detective Hensley stared at the photo for a long time, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. If it was real, Robert was still out there, alive, watching the chaos he had created, walking freely among the living. And the chase was far from over. The photograph changed everything. After months of dead ends and speculation, the image of a gaunt man sipping coffee outside a Florida grocery store reignited the manhunt. The timestamp, the posture, the faint scar on the left cheek, every detail matched Robert Whitaker. The only problem was the date. He was supposed to be dead. Detective Laura Hensley stared at the enlarged photo projected on the briefing room wall. "It's him," she said. Her voice was steady, but her pulse quickened. Mercer crossed his arms, skeptical. "We buried 4 victims, Laura. We found his boat. We found his blood on the dock. Maybe someone wants us to think he's alive. Then let's find out who." Agents from the FBI's behavioral unit were brought in to reanalyze the timeline. The forensic evidence, the satchel, the Bible, the knife, all pointed to Robert. But one fact now stood out: none of his fingerprints had been lifted from the boat's outer surface, only from the inside. That suggested staging. Someone had handled the vessel carefully, maybe to fake his death. And then there was the blood. A smear on the dock matched Robert's DNA, but the pattern didn't fit a fatal wound. It was more likely from a cut or deliberate self-inflicted injury, just enough to leave a trace. The conclusion was chilling. Robert might have planned his own vanishing all along. 2 weeks after the photograph surfaced, a new tip arrived from St. Augustine, Florida. A woman named Janice Meadows, a motel clerk, reported a man calling himself Daniel Wright, the same alias Robert had used in Louisiana. He was polite, she told investigators. Kept to himself, always carried a little notebook. Said he was writing a memoir. When shown the photo, she nodded immediately. "That's him. He gave me $100 bill and said to donate the change to the quiet ones. I didn't know what that meant." Security footage confirmed her story. The man's gait, his mannerisms, the way he held his left wrist slightly bent, all identical to Robert's movements in older videos. He had indeed survived the storm. And more disturbing, he seemed to be building something new. The next clues came in fragments: anonymous social media posts quoting obscure scripture, small payments funneled through online donation sites tied to the Old Sons of Revelation network. Each was signed with the initials D.W. But investigators recognized the phrasing immediately. "The circle sleeps, but the sea will birth another. Silence is not death. It is preparation." Detective Hensley rubbed her temples as she read through them. "He's recruiting again," she murmured. Mercer leaned over her shoulder. "Or testing who's still loyal." Agents traced the digital trail to a rented property on the outskirts of Palatka, Florida, an isolated 2-story house bordered by overgrown pines. The electricity was active, but the name on the lease belonged to a deceased man from Georgia. It was a setup. They arrived before dawn, a full task force moving quietly under the trees. The house looked abandoned, curtains drawn, no movement inside. When the door was forced open, a thick, musty air rolled out. On the walls were hand-painted symbols identical to those found in Robert's journals. Candles lined the windowsills, and on the table lay a map of the eastern seaboard marked with red circles. At the center of the map was a single note: "The prophet returns where the silence began." Pinned beside it was a photograph: the Whitaker home in Virginia. Hensley's breath caught. He's going back. Within hours, roadblocks and alerts went out across the East Coast. But deep down, she knew Robert wasn't running. He was circling back to the place where his so-called cleansing began, the house on Brookfield Lane. The property had long been sealed and condemned, but in early spring of the following year, neighbors began reporting strange activity: lights flickering at night, doors creaking open, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing inside. Most dismissed it as local folklore, the ghost of a killer haunting his own crime scene. Until one night, a motion-activated security camera across the street caught something undeniable. At 2:14 a.m., under a pale wash of moonlight, a man stepped through the broken gate. He wore a dark coat, his head slightly bowed. He paused at the edge of the yard, looked toward the terrace, the place where his family had been found, and stood motionless for nearly a minute. Then, without hesitation, he disappeared inside the house. The face, though obscured, was unmistakable. Robert Whittaker had come home. When police arrived at dawn, the house was empty. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and damp earth. In the living room, a Bible lay open on the floor, its pages wet with condensation. On one of them, underlined in black ink, was a verse from Isaiah. "Come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow." Next to it was a handwritten line in Robert's scrawl, "The circle completes when truth is seen." Hensley's voice trembled as she read it aloud. "He's not done," she whispered. "He's preparing for something." Mercer looked out through the shattered window toward the terrace. "Or someone," he said. That evening, as officers packed up evidence, Hensley lingered in the front yard. The last of the daylight stretched across the grass, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement near the trees, a flicker of shadow, gone before she could focus. Whether it was her imagination or something else, she couldn't tell. But one thing was clear: Robert Whittaker wasn't finished. He had survived death, vanished into myth, and now returned to the place that had made him a monster. And whatever he intended to do next would determine whether his story ended, or began again. The return of Robert Whittaker sent shockwaves through both the investigation and the public. After months of silence and presumed death, he had stepped back into the world, not to hide, but to make a statement. The footage from the neighbor's camera played on every major news network. To the public, it was proof of a ghost come to life. To Detective Laura Hensley, it was a warning. She barely slept that week. Every night she replayed the grainy footage, Robert standing in the moonlight, motionless, facing the burial ground of his family. She studied every frame, the way his shoulders lifted as if he whispered a prayer, the stillness that followed. It wasn't the behavior of a man seeking redemption. It was ritual. The next step was obvious: they had to find him before he finished what he'd come back for. The house revisited. A full tactical team was stationed in the Brookfield Lane area. Officers swept the neighborhood, knocking on doors, interviewing residents who might have seen something. One neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Givens, told them, "I saw him again, 2 nights after that footage. Standing by the old oak near the terrace. He was just watching the house. Didn't move. Didn't run. Like he was waiting for someone." Hensley knew what that meant. Robert wasn't there to destroy the past. He was there to complete it, whatever that meant in the twisted theology of the Sons of Revelation. That evening, while cataloging new evidence, she received a message from the forensic lab. The ink found on the Bible pages in the Whittaker house matched the same type of marker recovered from the property in Florida. There was no longer any doubt: Robert had been there in both places. He was moving deliberately, leaving breadcrumbs only his followers would understand. Mercer looked over the lab report and frowned. "It's like he's building a trail of scripture. A pilgrimage." Hensley nodded. "A final sermon. The revelation." 2 days later, the investigation reached its breaking point. A call came in from a park ranger in the Shenandoah foothills, less than 50 miles from Brookfield Lane. A hiker had found an abandoned campsite deep in the woods, a small tent, a campfire still warm, and a single item pinned to a tree, a laminated photo of Robert's family, taken months before their deaths. On the back, a message was scrawled. "They rest in silence. I await the call." Near the campsite lay another symbol, a circle made of stones, each etched with a single letter. Together, they formed the word return. Inside the tent, officers found a portable cassette recorder. When they pressed play, a man's calm voice filled the forest air. It was unmistakably Robert's. "To those who follow," he said, "do not fear what was done. The world rejected the pure, and I was chosen to cleanse what I had corrupted. They sleep without sin, and I walk the path of truth. When the sea and the soil meet, I will join them in silence. Until then, I remain among you." The tape clicked off, leaving a hiss of static. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mercer muttered, "He's still preaching to his ghosts." The last sight. The next morning, park surveillance picked up movement on a nearby trail. A lone man, matching Robert's description, was walking toward the river that bordered the forest. When rangers followed, they found his footprints leading to a rocky overlook, and then stopping abruptly at the edge. Below, the river raged from recent rain. They found no body. But lying on the rocks was Robert's jacket, neatly folded, with a note inside the pocket. "The circle is quiet now." It was signed simply, R.W. Aftermath. The search for Robert Whittaker officially ended 2 weeks later. Without a body, he was declared missing, presumed dead. But to many, the absence of proof was proof itself, that he had once again staged his own disappearance, slipping into another version of the myth he had built. The Sons of Revelation began to dissolve after federal raids on their remaining properties. Silas Crane, the founder, was never found. Some said he died years earlier. Others whispered he had gone underground, waiting for the prophet's return. Detective Hensley stayed on the case long after it went cold. She visited the Whittaker home one last time before it was demolished, the air inside stale, heavy with dust and memory. The terrace, once a grave, was gone, replaced by clean earth and new grass. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Robert's shadow lingered there, somewhere between guilt and faith. Mercer joined her, silent for a moment before asking, "Do you think he's really gone?" Hensley looked out at the fading light. "Men like him don't just disappear," she said quietly. "They become stories. And stories never die." Years passed. The Whittaker murders faded from headlines, reduced to true crime specials and late-night podcasts. But every so often, something strange surfaced, a letter mailed from an unknown sender, each containing a Bible verse and the same handwritten signature, R.W. The most recent one arrived on the anniversary of the family's discovery. It read, "The silence continues. The circle watches." No one knew if the letters were authentic, or the work of someone feeding the legend. But for Detective Laura Hensley, it didn't matter. She kept them locked away in a drawer, reminders of a man who had turned faith into horror, and a family who paid the ultimate price for his delusion. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she would think of the final words on the tape and wonder if they held a twisted truth, "When the sea and the soil meet, I will join them in silence." Because in some dark corner of her mind, she wasn't sure the silence had ever truly begun. The case of Robert Whittaker remains one of the most haunting mysteries in modern American crime. A father driven by pride, debt, and devotion to a false faith, a family silenced in the name of salvation, and a killer who may have walked into legend rather than justice. To this day, no body has been recovered. Only the echo of his words remains. The circle is quiet now.